This is the final session of our series on the menstrual cycle. This is session 4, and we are going to complete the topic of menstrual cycle in this session. So far we have completed, and I hope you've understood the meaning of the different phases, and we have understood up till the process of ovulation, which is basically the follicular phase in the ovary. So we have done this much, and today we will proceed with the luteal phase. And luteal phase is characterized by the formation of the structure called the corpus luteum, and the structure is formed in the ovary after the process of ovulation and the rupturing of the Graafian follicle. Now corpus luteum is basically stands for the yellow body, right? And here we have the corpus luteum. Let me highlight it. So this structure here is the corpus luteum, and it looks nothing like the Graafian follicle. You cannot clearly see the granulosa cells, you cannot see the antrum because the antrum has ruptured and released all of its hormones. So this is exactly the point which we have passed beyond. So now the concentration of the luteinizing hormone will fall down. The follicular stimulating hormone, their concentrations are also going to fall down, and at the same time we have an extremely high surge in the progesterone content and the estrogen hormone. Now why is this concentration risen out here? It is because of the rupturing of the antrum of the Graafian follicle, as well as because of the presence of the structure called the corpus luteum. Now corpus luteum, the structure Graafian follicle, eventually heals up after it has released its contents outside, which basically contains the secondary oocyte in the first polar body. The corpus luteum remains behind. It heals the wound and it stays onto in the cortical region of the ovary, and corpus luteum starts to produce hormones, namely estrogen and progesterone. Now you must remember that as the antrum has ruptured and the secondary follicles are present but they have undergone atresis, the concentration of estrogen can fall down, and if the concentration of estrogen falls down, then the endometrial lining in the uterus will start to rupture, which means menstruation can begin. But this must be prevented at the moment for the next 14 days beyond ovulation, because see, the secondary oocyte along with the polar body and the granular cells are still traveling. They are somewhere in the fallopian tube, waiting or probably expecting fertilization by a male gamete. So the fertilization will take a certain period of time. Usually the fertilization must take place between 24 to 48 hours of ovulation, and beyond that, even if fertilization takes place, successful pregnancies do not take place. Even if fertilization takes place, usually the process of the phenomenon of pregnancy does not occur. So if between 24 to 48 hours of the process of ovulation, if a sperm fertilizes the secondary oocyte, and if metaphase 2 is broken and a true egg is formed, then the chances of implantation do happen. And if implantation has to happen, this endometrial lining must be retained. And this is the importance of corpus luteum, as there is no luteinizing hormone, right, and no more follicular cells are being formed. There is no secondary follicular structures within the ovary that are going to actively release a lot of progesterone and estrogen. Corpus luteum stays in the ovary and starts to release the two hormones within the ovary, which are then transported to the blood, and through the blood they reach the different parts of the body, even primarily the uterine lining, the endometrium, which keep receiving these two hormones, and the structure is maintained. Now as a result of the higher concentrations of progesterone and estrogen in the luteal phase, now I hope you now realize why the next 14 days are called luteal phase, because in the ovary during the next 14 days the structure corpus luteum shows dominating presence, and they keep releasing the hormones. Now during the luteal phase, as the concentration of progesterone and estrogen are high, the proliferation does not take place. The proliferation takes place for only 7 days, which means the endometrial lining grows and develops good amounts of blood vessels. But now the next 14 days during the luteal phase, in the uterus, the events that are taking place are secretory in nature. So while the ovary is undergoing the luteal phase, the uterus is experiencing a period of 14 days, which is known as the secretory phase. And why is this phase called secretory phase in the endometrium? Is because now the endometrium becomes much more richer in variety of blood vessels, and a large number of variety of glandular structures or glandular tissues or gland cells appear and start working actively in the endometrial lining. They release large amounts of watery contents which are rich in nutrients and many other components which are responsible not only for the implantation of the expected embryo, and but also their role later on becomes in nourishing the embryo. So the endometrial lining becomes secretory in nature, it becomes glandular in nature, and hence this phase in the uterus is called the secretory phase. While the secretory phase is going on in the ovary, we have the luteal phase, and the luteal phase is also characterized by the production of these hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now for the next 14 days this process continues. The endometrial lining is maintained and made heavily glandular by the action of corpus luteum. But in case if there is no fertilization, if the copulation has taken place or has not taken place, and the sperms, if present, are unable to fertilize, this secondary oocyte are unable to make an egg and later on the zygote and the different stages of the embryo, if that does not happen, then the corpus luteum, this structure here, the corpus luteum, begins to undergo atresis. I hope now you remember the meaning of the word atresis. Atresis simply means degradation or degeneration. Atresis. For the exams you can simply write down the degradation of the structure. So the corpus luteum starts to undergo degradation, it starts to undergo deformation, and the cells responsible are primarily macrophages and variety of other enzymes present in the ovarian tissue, and corpus luteum shrinks in size, and eventually it completely becomes dysfunctional, it becomes acellular, there are no more cells left in it, and it becomes a fibrous scar present inside the ovary, and that fibrous scar is again called the Corpus Albicans. I don't have the image for Corpus Albicans, but Corpus Albicans is just like a fibrous scar. Here we have the Corpus Albicans, and Corpus Albicans is formed after the luteal phase, after the 14th day. And then as there is no corpus luteum left, there is no more production of estrogen and progesterone. And if there is no more estrogen and progesterone after 14th day, in the absence of estrogen and progesterone, the endometrial lining does not get any more stimulus, hormonal signals. There are no more hormonal signals for the maintenance and secretory nature of the maintenance of the endometrial lining, and the endometrium starts to undergo degeneration, which is basically the initiation of the menstrual phase. And the menstrual phase continues from anywhere from 1 to 7 days. Some textbooks mention 1 to 5 days, but we will take 1 to 7 days as the period of menstruation, and this is a variable period. It varies from a female to the other. Anyways, so we have understood what happens in the luteal phase. Now we've also understood if there is no fertilization, what happens to corpus luteum, and once corpus luteum vanishes, how does the next phase start? But now let us assume that the event of fertilization does take place, and if the fertilization event takes place, then what happens next? Now in case fertilization takes place, right, if the sperm fuses with the secondary oocyte, now secondary oocyte is in metaphase 2 of meiosis 2, which we've already dealt with, and we get a functional egg, and we get like 3 polar bodies which are then discarded, and this the true egg or the ova, now the egg, the nucleus of this egg and the nucleus of the sperm, they fuse together and they form the zygote. Let's look at a couple of new slides, next slides, and here we've got the zygote, and this is the zygote. You don't have to, now there are so many terms on this slide, I don't want you to remember any of them, only the ones that I'm going to speak about. So now we have got the zygote, and where is the zygote? The zygote is still traveling in the fallopian tube, because the event of fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube. So now let us assume that we have the zygote somewhere here. Now the zygote, on its way to the uterus. Now it is traveling and it's on its way to the uterus, where we got the endometrial lining, the ready endometrial lining, which is ready to receive the developing embryo. Now while this zygote is traveling through the fallopian tube, it starts to undergo division, and then we get a 2-cell stage and 4-cell and 16-cell, and then eventually we get cleavages, which are divisions of the cells. The cells keep becoming smaller and smaller. The size of the zygote doesn't change, so there is a lot of division, and then there is compaction. You don't need to remember all of these, but what we need to remember is there is a stage called the blastocyst, and also then the next stage called the trophoblast stage. Now let us just look at this particular image right here. So what do we see in this image here? Now this developing embryo that has gone through so many stages, divisions of cells, formation of a cavity, and a variety of different types of cells are formed. Now we'll just remember this as the embryo, and particularly which stage? The trophoblast. So this is called the trophoblast stage. And when this embryo in the trophoblast stage reaches the endometrium, let us say it reaches somewhere here, and see here we have got the endometrial cells. Let me highlight using the pointer. So these are the endometrial cells, and here we got the trophoblast. Now the trophoblast when it reaches the endometrial lining and it starts to undergo implantation. Now you see I have drawn this big circle around this particular structure. These longitudinal long columnar cells are the cells of the uterus, the endometrial lining, and here now we have got this embryo that has now invaded the endometrium, and this invasion is called implantation. Basically the embryo is now getting inside, it has to get inside the endometrium here, and this process is called implantation. Now the moment this process begins, there are these cells called the trophoblasts in the embryo. Here we have got these cells called the trophoblasts, right? And these particular cells of this whole structure, what do these cells do? The trophoblast cells of this embryo structure called the trophoblast starts to produce a hormone called HCG, and this hormone stands for human chorion gonadotrophin hormone. Now why is it called so? Because it is produced by humans, and it is produced by a layer of cells called chorion. Have a look here. Right, now once the embryo implants, it undergoes variety of other stages and it forms a structure like this, right? So you don't need to know the names, but you must remember that the developing embryo has got a layer of cells called trophoblasts. This is what you need to remember. Trophoblasts produce a hormone called HCG. Now human chorion gonadotrophin, what is the importance of this hormone is something that we'll look at now. Now if you remember, what was responsible for the existence of corpus luteum? Corpus luteum exists because of the presence of the luteinizing hormone. If you remember, when luteinizing hormone was released in higher concentrations, ovulation took place, and it is only because of this luteinizing hormone that corpus luteum is formed. And corpus luteum, the life of corpus luteum actually depends on the presence of luteinizing hormone. So we see that during the luteal phase, the concentration of LH keeps on decreasing and decreasing and decreasing, and when it decreases to a certain point, the corpus luteum is getting no more signals to stay alive, and then it undergoes degeneration. Now if corpus luteum has to be kept alive, why do we need to keep corpus luteum alive? Because we need these two hormones, estrogen and we need progesterone. Corpus luteum must be kept alive for the production of these two hormones so that the uterine lining can be maintained. And this is now what happens, that the trophoblast, the hormone HCG that they release now, they take up the role of the luteinizing hormone, because the brain has been told not to produce luteinizing hormone. Why is this so? Because the concentration of progesterone and estrogen are so high. I hope you remember again that higher concentrations of estrogen and progesterone tell the anterior pituitary to not secrete LH and FSH. Right? There's a negative feedback. The only one time when estrogen and progesterone give a positive feedback is just before the process of ovulation, when we see the LH surge. Anyways, let's not get back too far away and proceed further. Now the human chorion gonadotrophin hormone takes up the role of luteinizing hormone because there is no LH. So HCG is now secreted by the embryo, by the developing embryo, the trophoblast cells in the around the uterine lining. From there they get into the blood, they reach the ovaries, and inside the ovaries, this particular hormone HCG, once it reaches the ovaries, it keeps the corpus luteum alive, and corpus luteum keeps on making the estrogen and progesterone, thus maintaining the endometrial lining throughout the period of pregnancy. I hope this much is clear, the function of HCG. Now the embryo here, once it is implanted, once it becomes much more complicated in structure like this, it forms another structure. And let me just rub this off. So what we've seen so far is that right at the time of implantation, exactly at this point where the embryo starts to get into the endometrial lining, right at this point the trophoblast cells start producing HCG. But now the embryo just does not stop here, it has to further develop. So it gets into the wall, it gets into the uterine wall, and these particular cells, the trophoblast and the other cells, they form a structure called the trophoectoderm, and this is the trophoectoderm. And this structure will eventually, now you don't have to remember trophoectoderm, you don't have to remember anything here, but I'm just trying to tell you that these particular cells, some of the cells of the placenta, let's make it much more simpler, some of the cells of the embryo now form finger-like projections, and these finger-like projections here, they enter the uterine wall, they go somewhere inside the uterine wall, and this structure stays in the uterus. And this structure that you see here that stays in the uterus eventually will become a fetus. Let me show you in the next slide. And here you see, so this is the hollow uterus, not so big. Now the uterus, the developing fetus will take most of the space of the uterus, and these particular cells, the trophoblasts that we were talking about, the ones that were entering the uterine lining here, these trophoblasts, they form these finger-like projections, and these finger-like projections now form a structure called the placenta, right? So some parts of the embryo, which are called trophoblasts, the cells of the trophoblast which enter the uterine lining, form the placenta. Now why are we studying the placenta? See, now the corpus luteum is being maintained by HCG. So corpus luteum is alive. Now why do we need, what is the role of the placenta? Now placenta, as you've studied in your previous classes, it has one major role of transportation, moving the wastes out and bringing in nutrients and essential gases, like for example oxygen, into the fetus. So that is one of the functions of the placenta. But one very important hormonal function, the endocrine function of placenta, also exists, which is the placenta also produces estrogen and produces progesterone. Along with that, it also produces another hormone called relaxin, which you do not know to understand at the moment. But these two hormones, okay, let us also talk about relaxin. So it also produces a hormone called relaxin, which has the function of relaxing the pelvic muscles during childbirth. But this we'll do later. At the moment, you must realize the placenta also starts to produce estrogen and progesterone. So during pregnancy, the structures that are producing estrogen and progesterone for the maintenance of the endometrium are the corpus luteum and the placenta. But placenta takes over the role during the later stages. So there is this higher amount of estrogen progesterone in the blood, which maintains the endometrial lining and thus keeps the fetus alive throughout the gestation period. Now gestation period is the time during the formation of the zygote, from the point of implantation till the time of childbirth. So that is called the gestation period. So the function of these hormones is to maintain pregnancy primarily. Now relaxin is also released, which is then used up during the later stages. Anyways, so we have covered what are the different changes that take place in the luteal phase and what are the changes that take place during pregnancy, the hormonal changes that take place during pregnancy. And I hope now this entire process, this entire cyclic process, the menstrual cycle, is amply clear to you. I hope now you can exclusively describe the ovarian events, which are just two, the follicular phase and the luteal phase, if you are asked only about these. And I hope you can also explain the three phases of the uterus: the menstrual phase, which spans 1 to 7 days, right? And you can also describe the proliferative phase, which is basically the 7 days till the process of ovulation. And I hope you can also describe what happens during the secretory phase, which is the third phase in the uterus. Along with that, I hope that you will be able to also describe the hormonal regulation of menstrual cycle phase by phase. What particular hormone has what particular function, and how is a particular hormone regulated. Also, you should be able to describe post fertilization events, hormonal events. What is the function of corpus luteum? How is it kept alive? What takes up the role of luteinizing hormone? Why is HCG, secretion of HCG, important? I hope you can answer all of these questions now. And with this, we come to an end of the menstrual cycle. Thank you.